Ben Hecht, who was a very famous and renowned playwright, journalist, author, in 1948 stated very cogently, "A Jewish nation will remove our mystery and give us origins and permit us to thrive in the world on an equal footing with other nationals. A David stands against Goliath. I ask you, Jews, buy him a stone for his slingshot." This was a very courageous statement, and it's so true then, and so true today. If we're not familiar with the past, we cannot understand the present, and those who cannot understand the present cannot see what lies ahead. That was according to a quote from Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's late father, the great historian and professor Benzion Netanyahu, on his 100th birthday. And Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. famously stated, "When people criticize Zionists, they mean Jews. You're talking anti-Semitism." So I call this section Israel 101, Geography. Very important to understand how big Israel is relative to its neighbors and relative to other countries, because most people really have no clue, because of the mass focus on Israel microscopically in the news and in the media. We think Israel is this big, enormous, powerful country with millions and millions of citizens, and that's completely and utterly not the case whatsoever. Let's first talk about the 1949 ceasefire lines. These are the lines at the end of the War of Independence, Israel's War of Independence, after 6 Arab armies attacked Israel after rejecting the UN partition plan in November of 1947. Abba Eban, Israel's famous foreign minister and author, called these the, quote, Auschwitz lines. There are many maps I could go through to show you the evolution of the state of Israel and how it came to be, how Israel was reborn. Here's just one little poster. But let's talk about the beginnings here, the Palestine Mandate. Now, after the conclusion of World War I, when the Ottoman Empire was finally destroyed and dismantled, the European powers that were successful and won the War of Independence, won World War I, specifically the British and the French, they divvied up land in the Middle East to create the modern states that we have so much trouble with today, because frankly, these lines were lines drawn not for the purposes of retaining the local populations and their tribes and their political establishments, but basically for the purposes of the national interests of the British and the French, and they put their friends in power so they can maintain control of such things as oil, which was being developed at that time. The Palestine Mandate is the entire area that you see here, Jewish Palestine on the left, which is the western part, and Transjordan on the right. This is an area that was created in 1922, actually it was created in 1920 from San Remo, and it establishes that the British were maintained in control administratively of this territory. They didn't own it, but they were given the mandate from the from the League of Nations, just before the United Nations, from the League of Nations to maintain it. And this is going back from the Balfour Declaration, where British Lord Balfour basically stated, with the consent of Her Majesty's government, that they looked favorably upon this area to be the national home for the Jewish people. The entire area, Jewish Palestine and Transjordan, which is the eastern section. This entire area was to be designated as the national homeland for the Jewish people. However, unfortunately, in 1922, the British, and I would say illegally, lopped off 78% of the landmass, which was to the east, created a country called Transjordan, put their Hashemite kingdom in there, and then Western Palestine was the area where now only Jews were to be developed or allowed to be coming into to create their state. So already from the get-go, the Jewish state was already confined to a very small area on the western portion of Palestine. Now, why do they call this area Palestine? It's a regional name, and it comes from the term from the Philistines way back. But Jews had always been living in this area. For thousands of years, they never left. And they maintained a population centers in Jerusalem and other places. But the population was very small. So this is what the Palestine Mandate looked like. And you can see 77% according to this map was Transjordan, which was an Arab country. Already an entire Arab country was created out of the Palestine Mandate. So when you hear of a two-state solution, so to speak, that already happened in 1922. And the Arabs got 77% of the land. This is how Dry Bones put it. It's the same thing, the British Mandate in 1920, as I stated. Today's Kingdom of Jordan. So in Geography 101, as we heard the quote from Ben Hector I quoted for earlier, I call this Land for Peace, David versus Goliath. Now if you look at this map over here, you'll see a bigger Israel than the West Bank and Gaza, so to speak. This is how the media wants to portray that Israel is this big giant country and these tiny little areas of Gaza and the West Bank where the Arabs are supposed to be having their country. Israel's oppressing them because Israel's the big Goliath and they're the David. So, as I said, we call this map called the West Bank. I call it Judea Samaria. At the minimum, Judea Samaria's names that were from the biblical times, and even the United Nations back in 1947 used the term the hill country of Judea. That was always known as Judea. We'll talk about where the term West Bank comes in at another segment here, but suffice it to say, let me just say very briefly that the term West Bank was invented by Jordan after they illegally maintained control of this area in yellow from the 1948 war. They were there illegally, and they called it the West Bank. You know what I call it? Judea Samaria. You know what I call Jordan? The East Bank. And if you look at some news accounts here, this is a map of the Middle East displayed on the Obama administration's video released days before Obama spoke and visited Israel in 2013. And look at this area that's missing over here. That's West Bank, so-called West Bank and Gaza. These areas are in dispute. And again, another whole video will talk about whose rights, what rights Israel has to that territory. But this is not secure and recognized boundaries as the United Nations partition plan and resolutions call for. So Israel has shrunk, again, it's very important, from the entire Palestine Mandate to just the western section of Palestine to now an area which takes out Judea, Samaria, and the West Bank. Now this is the most important map that you really need to understand who David and Goliath is. Because Israel stands alone in the Middle East and in North Africa. Now where's Israel? Tiny Israel, that oasis of democracy, is right here in this little red dot. This little red dot represents Israel. The green is the color of Islam. These represent the 57 dominated Muslim states in the world. And they're all around Israel. So who's the David and who's the Goliath? 57 states, which is slightly less than 1/3 of all the states in the United Nations. How big is Israel? You know, I talk to people all the time, and they think because Israel's in the news, it must be this big, enormous state. But if you look at the maps in proportion, Israel's tiny. It's really basically the size of New Jersey. But look at this here. Look how small Israel is. It fits inside New York State. It's barely bigger than Vermont and some of the New England states, but it's really basically the size of New Jersey. So when we're talking about so-called land for peace, what land can be given up for peace? Let's talk about Israel's coastline. It's only 112 miles. It's only 260 miles at its longest, 60 miles at its widest, and 3 to 9 miles at its narrowest. And I'll show you some other graphics about that. It's about 8,000 square miles, the size of the state of New Jersey, as I stated. Only 1/19 the size of California. Fits into Florida 7 times. Fits into the United States 768 times. And it is 1/625th or 1/6 of 1% the size of the Arab world. And if you count Iran, which is not an Arab country but certainly a Muslim country, that ratio jumps to 650 to 1. Now, how narrow is narrow? Well, again, I'll talk about that in a moment, but Israel is surrounded by 22 hostile Arab Muslim states. These are the 22 states of the Arab League. They want to create the 23rd state, the state of Palestine, like that's going to be a peaceful state. Talk about population. Again, going back to David versus Goliath, the population of the Arab Muslim states, including Iran, is 350 million, maybe close to 400 million now. 56 or 57 Islamic countries, depending on how you count it. They're about 1.4, 1.5, I've seen 1.6 and 7. I've seen all sorts of numbers around that area, a number of billions of Muslims worldwide. There are about 6.5 now million Jews in Israel. 6.5 million Jews in Israel. That's it. The regional population ratio is 56 to 1. There are approximately 1.2 million Arabs living in Israel as full citizens. The last statistic I find very horrifying, very disturbing. I sometimes ask people, in talking to them on the streets or in conversation, how many Jews do you think there are in the world? Because it seems like the news magnifies this. People say to me, there must be 50 million Jews, 100 million Jews. Unfortunately, that's not even close. There are only approximately 13.5 million to maybe 14 million Jews in the entire world today. That's almost 5 million fewer than in 1939 before the Holocaust. And the margin of error in the population of China on any given day. So these are the dimensions of Israel proper. And just take a look at this map here. And I'm going to explain a few things which are very important. F stands for the area that's 9 miles wide over here. And I'm going to show you a relief map of this. 9 miles wide at the point where, at F, at the most western part of the so-called West Bank to the sea, to the Mediterranean Sea. It's only 9 miles wide. The Gaza Strip is only 5 miles deep and 25 miles wide, about the size of Manhattan, I think. This is a map which our good friend Mark Langfan has developed and allowed us to use, which shows how vulnerable Israel would be against today's weaponry if pushed back into what Abba Eban, we said, was the Auschwitz lines here. And you can study this and see the Israel Population Center is about 70% of the Jewish population lives between Jerusalem and Tel Aviv in that 9-mile corridor. And here's a map showing the rocket ranges from Gaza, the thousands of rockets where they could reach. And they could reach now into Tel Aviv, Ben Gurion Airport, and Jerusalem. So here's a very important map, a close-up view of the Jewish homeland's heartland, the 9 miles wide here. And when I talk about 9 miles wide, this will give you an example. It's kind of an amusing commentary, but it really was important. When George W. Bush was a candidate for president in 1999, he was taken on a helicopter tour of Israel by then Defense Minister Ariel Sharon, who not only took George W. Bush, but many other American leaders, many other political leaders, and they got an understanding of how big Israel really is, or really how small Israel is. Because again, if you haven't been there, you don't understand. So when Sharon was telling him about the 9-mile wide corridor, George W. said, well, you know, we have driveways in Texas that are longer than that. And when I say this in front of people, they laugh. But it's true. Now, let me show you here a two-dimensional map. This is a relief map of Israel. What I like about this is that it really shows you what you can't be shown on those maps that are two-dimensional. Because you understand that the hills of Judea and Samaria are hills indeed. That's these green upcroppings over here. If you've been to Israel, you understand that this Israel is 2,000 and 3,000 feet high, the promontory over here on the Judea West Bank. You don't have to be a military genius to understand that being in control of the high ground gives you a military advantage. And when the Arabs were controlling that area, what were they doing? They were firing down on Israeli cities, population centers, and they could fire right on Ben Gurion Airport. That's right here, right in this area here. 2,000 and 3,000 feet up. You'll understand that this is a major defensive barrier that Israel has coming from its eastern flank if anyone wanted to invade from the east. The Golan Heights also is an area that's about 3,000 feet high. When the Syrians controlled that, all they were doing was shelling Israeli communities. It's so important for Israel to maintain control of the high ground, but this is what you have to understand. And a lot of Jews, and all of them soldiers, died in the 1948 war to keep open the narrow lifeline to Jerusalem. If you ever have traveled and been to Israel, coming from the airport up to the Judean hills into Jerusalem, you see remnants of that war. This is a map of the Jerusalem today. It's the municipal map. The Arab communities are shown in yellow. Jewish communities are in blue. If you look at actually the far right-hand side, you have an area called Ma'ale Adumim. I mentioned that before. That's where SodaStream was located. And as you can see, where it says Old City, that is in the eastern section of Jerusalem, before Israel united the city in 1967. You can see the Old City, of course, is where the Temple Mount is located, and on top of that is the Al-Aqsa Mosque. There's Ramallah up there. That's the capital of the Palestinian Authority. That's how close it is to Jerusalem. Now, these are some pictures that show some illegal Arab activity inside Jerusalem. What are these up here? These black holdings, the canisters. Well, basically, they are up there illegally because these Arabs who own these properties are trying to evade paying for utilities and getting their own utilities. They're off the grid. Israel could take them down. They don't, but they could, but they're not permitted correctly. Just like in our hometown over here. Here, in many other cities and communities, if you want to build, you need a permit. It's that simple. It's not discriminatory. Further examples. I mentioned before Israel's legal grounds that we have. Israel has to the area of Judea and Samaria today, the West Bank. These are areas which at the best are disputed under international law, but in fact, we believe that Israel has far greater rights than the Arabs do. Because in fact, it was illegally occupied by the Jordanians from 1948 to 1967 when Israel liberated it, those areas. And in fact, that was from a defensive war when Israel was able to evict the Jordanians, who renounced any claims to that area, I think back in the 1980s. Therefore, they don't even have, they were the so-called last sovereign there. They renounced any rights they have. There's never been a Palestinian Arab state in that territory. Jews have been there beforehand. It's at best disputed territory. It is not in any way, shape, or form automatically Palestinian territory for a Palestinian state. So these are some things to think about with Geography 101. Again, dry bones, he says it all over here. Look at the quickie quiz on the left. Housing regulations in the Palestinian Authority provide the death penalty for selling land to a Jew, compared to housing regulations in Israel, which allow Jews to build homes in Jerusalem. Now, which regulation offends the current United States administration? Look at the middle one here, a simple question. If a two-state solution means a Palestine with no Jewish towns or cities in it, which I alluded to in another segment on apartheid, does that mean the Palestinian towns and cities inside Israel will also have to be uprooted and expelled? It's actually a very important question. And looking here at the last one here, the State Department has a secret plan to move the American embassy to Jerusalem. Yes? Yes, they do, and they call it Step 2. So what's Step 1? Declaring Jerusalem the capital of Palestine. So what's the answer? Can Israel get fair coverage? We have to stop using these terms designed to denigrate Israel, lean on our leaders and advocates to stop using terms, and demand that the Western media stop using them too. If we forfeit the language, we forfeit our heritage and our history. And again, these are civilizations, nations, and empires that have tried to destroy the Jewish people. And God bless Israel, the smallest of nations, but with a friend in the highest of places. So be nice.